Good morning. I am Dr. Dave Clements, professor from the Faculty of Natural and Applied Sciences, co-chairing this conference alongside my colleague, Dr. Barb Astle, professor of nursing. And as we open up this morning, we would like to acknowledge that Trinity Western University, our Langley campus here, is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of Astalo people. And I'm really excited about introducing our plenary speaker, Dr. Jessica Moerman. I met her this past summer in Toronto at a conference there, and it was interesting. She had laryngitis, so I got to introduce her a day after when she'd recovered, and I quickly learned this is a voice that's very important to hear, and I'm glad you get to hear this voice this morning. She is president and CEO at the Evangelical Environmental Network, the EEN, and she's also a co-founding pastor at Grace Capital City Church, which she planted in 2016 with her husband, Chris, in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining EEN, Jessica was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy. She received a PhD in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and has held research positions, get this, at John Hopkins University, University of Michigan, and the Smithsonian National Museum of History, where she researched how climate has changed through Earth's history. And I happened to be in Washington this past year, and I saw this display, and I didn't realize Jessica was behind that. She regularly speaks at issues related to climate change, pollution, children's health, the clean energy transition, environmental stewardship, and the intersection of science and faith. So join me in welcoming Jessica Moerman from Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and thank you. It is such an honor to join you today. It's my sincere regrets that I'm not able to join in person, but I do just want to thank Dr. Clements and the entire organizing team, and especially the technical support today for all of their help organizing and their work organizing this incredible conference. It's a real honor to be able to speak and present with you, and specifically looking at this intersection of climate and health, and looking at what God's creation is telling us about this. And so to share a little bit about myself, I am a climate scientist by training. And one of my favorite things about this line of work is, for me, it is simply studying God's creation. And what I have found is that by doing this work, it has enhanced my faith, given me a bigger picture of God, and really filled me with awe and wonder. And this shouldn't be a surprise, because as we look in Genesis, when God not completes his creation, but when God, the culmination of God's creation, as it says in Genesis 1:31, when God has made the natural world, he's made us as humans and put us in it. He looks back in wonder and says that all that he has made, that it is very good. And that has just been my joy as a scientist, to study this very good creation that God has made. And I'm excited today to tell you what it's telling us about our current context, especially as related to climate and health. Now, before I begin, I'd love to tell you a little bit about myself as well. And one question I often get is, you may tell from my accent, I've got a Tennessee, Georgia accent. And one question I often get is, how did a Christian girl from the U.S. South get involved in climate change? And the simple answer, the one-word answer is Jesus, simply following Jesus. I got into this line of work. I am a climate scientist because I wanted to go into ministry. I felt a call into ministry at a young age, and but I didn't know what that looked like for myself as a 17, 18-year-old, feeling a call towards ministry, trying to decide what I was going to do with my life. I did what I later have found out was I prayed a dangerous prayer. I asked God, what would you have me do? And what he continued to reveal to me, prayer after prayer, because I didn't quite believe him on the first go, Each time I prayed, he said, go study geology. If you want to follow me into ministry, go study geology. I have to tell you, one, had no idea how geology and earth sciences fit together with ministry. But secondly, I wasn't even sure at that time if I could be a scientist and a Christian. And so this put me in a real dilemma. But God is so good in his graciousness. He put the right person in my path at the right time. This was the summer before leaving for university. And I got the question that so many incoming university students get from one of our youth leaders. He asked me, Jessica, what are you going to go study in university? And little did he know, I was about to spill my guts. And I just told him, I feel like God is calling me to study geology, but I don't know if I can do it. And he listened to me very patiently. And then when I'd finished, he graciously asked me, he said, Jessica, don't you realize I'm a geologist? I had no idea, but it was so important for me in that moment to see a church leader who was also a scientist, let alone the exact field that God was calling me into. It gave me that permission that I felt like I needed to be obedient to God's call. And so, even though I didn't have all the answers or see how all the puzzle pieces fit together, that's what I went and did. Studied geology. And again, in God's graciousness, he didn't leave me hanging for too long in putting all those puzzle pieces together. It was in a freshman lecture, geology lecture, where we were studying how we can use things in God's creation, the geologic record, to figure out what climate was like in the past, that God put all the puzzle pieces for me together. In that lecture, I can only attribute it to the Holy Spirit, put Matthew 22, Jesus's greatest commandments to us, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, brought that verse to mind in science class. And for me, I was listening and learning about climate, I remembered that I had heard how climate impacts the first and worst, that climate impacts the most vulnerable among us first and worst, those who are least responsible for it, the very people who God calls us to give special care are most impacted by the harms of climate change. And that is where it all came together for me, how geology, climate, and ministry fit together. And it was in that freshman paleoclimate lecture that set the trajectory for my life. And so, what I ended up doing was going to study paleoclimatology, the study of Earth's past climate history, so that I could be a part of that solution there. And so that is my particular brand of climate science, is paleoclimatology, where we use things in God's creation to answer questions like, why and how has temperature, rainfall changed across Earth's history? Because we know from science that Earth's climate history has varied greatly over time. This is a picture from the Smithsonian Natural History Museum showing that millions of years ago, even in Baffin Island, Canada, used to be warm and wet, swamp-like conditions. In Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, which is now a desert, swamp conditions as well, very, very wet. We know that Earth's climate has changed throughout its history. We know this from looking at geologic records, things in God's creation, specifically anything that forms in layers. We can read each of those layers like a page in a history book to reveal what Earth's climate was like before we had weather stations to measure it for ourselves. Now, as a paleoclimatologist, one of the key questions that I often get is, but wait, again, we know that Earth's climate has changed drastically throughout its history. What if climate change today is just part of another one of those natural cycles? And for sake of time, I'm not going to go into the full details of how we know what we know, but what my colleagues and I in paleoclimatology have done have taken many different approaches of answering that question, specifically looking at some of our culprits of past climate change. To cut to the punchline, none of these natural causes of climate change in the past are at play today. And what we know from studying God's creation, we know that it's due to us. Today's climate change and global warming is due to our activities, and specifically our use of carbon-rich energy sources, the burning of oil and gas and coal, which has brought incredible prosperity to the world, but it's come with a shadow side of the emission of climate warming gases like carbon dioxide and methane, also harmful pollutants that you're going to hear more from Reverend Mitch later. But this use of carbon-rich energy and the emission of greenhouse gases, this is what's responsible for warming our planet and the climate change that we see today. And I have to tell you, this is good news. It's good news that it's us. It's good news that it's not just part of a natural cycle, and I'll tell you why. Throughout Earth, our human history, our relationship with climate has been primarily that climate has influenced us. We have had to adapt, and we're at the mercy of these natural climate changes. Now that we flip the script and it's us influencing climate, this is good news because it means for the first time in human history, we have the power to do something about it. And I want to begin with this good news because when we look at the challenges that we face from our warming world, they are immense. But I don't want you to forget that we have this incredible opportunity before us, not only to do something about climate, but an opportunity to take these challenges to make a brighter, healthier, and more equitable world and future for ourselves and the next generation. And so as we explore the challenges that we face, I encourage you to keep this truth of the good news in front of you as well. So let's look at some of these challenges that we are facing today. This is this is how we know that our temperatures are rising. This is one of those iconic graphs that tell us that we are experiencing global warming today. What you see here is the change in global average temperatures. The temperatures across the entire globe from the 1880s to the present. And what we see again is this march towards warmer and warmer temperatures over 1 degree Celsius over a baseline temperature reference. And so one question that I often get with this is, well, 1 degree C, what's the big deal with that? Even in the course of, I'm joining you from the East Coast on the course of our day just so far of being at midday, we've seen much more, a higher increase in temperature, change in temperature over the course of half a day already. What's the big deal with 1 degree of temperature change? Well, the truth is that we don't live in the global average world, do we? We live in our local context, in the day-to-day extremes. And what we see is that when we have this small change in average temperatures, we have a big change in the extremes. What's happening as we are increasing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, as we're changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, it is pushing us towards a more extreme climate context, into more extreme heat, into more extreme weather. And again, this is where we live, in the day-to-day extremes. And so when we are pushing our bell curve into a higher likelihood of experiencing more extreme heat, more extreme climate, this is where things get dangerous. One question that I often get, though, also is, but why care? There's so many things to care about in the world. Why should I bring climate change to the forefront. And I love how Dr. Catherine Hayhoe puts it, a fellow evangelical Christian and climate scientist. She answers this question as the only reason we care about climate change is because it already affects everything we already care about today. And this is so true. Climate impacts all of the things we care about. Let's unpack this and explore this. This is just a non-exhaustive list of many of the things that we simply as people, but also as Christians, as people of faith, as family members, things that we care deeply about, whether that's especially in this context today, in this conference, of deep care about health and people's well-being. Also have deep cares of serving the poor, addressing hunger, addressing war and violence that can cause cascading crises from refugees and forced migration, human trafficking, the incredible injustices as it comes to prejudice by race, injustices to Indigenous people. All of these things that we care about are impacted by pollution and climate change. We simply need to draw that connection of how the people, the places, and the problems that we care about, and as Christians are called to serve in ministry, how climate impacts these things. And ultimately, what we find is that, as we say at the Evangelical Environmental Network, that caring well for God's creation, addressing climate and pollution, this is truly a matter of life. It's a matter of national security. It's a matter of addressing poverty and hunger. It's a matter of health. And we're going to explore that today. And so as we look at how climate impacts health, as we see these climatic changes, shifts in rainfall, warming temperatures, greater wildfires, it introduces new hazards, floods and droughts, violent storms, extreme heat, fire and smoke. This then impacts our health in many different ways, from injury, from extreme weather, mental illness, heat stress, increase in insect-borne diseases, lung disease, and allergies. Today, we're going to focus this morning on extreme heat. And I focus on extreme heat because it is one of those ubiquitous impacts that no matter where we're at, in our local context, in our communities, in our cities, we are seeing increasing threats of longer, more severe, more frequent heat waves and extreme heat. And also, when we look at the statistics, what we find is that extreme heat and heat waves have actually caused more deaths than any other natural disaster over the last 30 years. This is just incredible because often in the news, we hear so much about hurricanes and severe storms, wildfires, other hazards that are climate related, but it is extreme heat that actually is responsible for more deaths than any other. Let's dig into this. If we look worldwide, research shows that 5 million people die prematurely each year because of extreme heat. In the US, where I live, 12,000 heat-related deaths each year. This is astounding. This is heat as a silent killer, that often a threat that goes under the radar that we don't notice. If we look to the future, and these are statistics for the US, but the same story proportionally would play out in Canada as well. Without action, without cutting our emissions of greenhouse gases, it's estimated that by the year 2100, 110,000 Americans will suffer heat-related deaths each year. Now, the year 2100 may seem far away, but actually, I've got 2 young boys here at home, just celebrating my oldest son's 9th birthday. And the truth is if by the grace of God, if both my boys live a natural lifespan, they're going to see this 2100 world. This is their reality. It's not that far away. If we look at heat and hospitalizations, we also see that there's a regional difference in terms of vulnerability and risk to extreme heat. And I specifically want to point out for the Pacific Northwest and looking at your neighbors to the south in Washington and Oregon. When it comes to heat and hospitalizations, only needing to hit a heat index range of 81 degrees Fahrenheit before to trigger hospitalizations due to heat. We see that especially in our more northern regions like British Columbia. There is more of a risk and vulnerability to heat at lower temperatures than elsewhere in the country. And so this is something that, as we think about caring for the vulnerable in our communities and being prepared for the future as it comes to health, this is really important to be aware of, as we will be hitting that 81 regional heat index more often and for longer periods as global warming persists. We can look at the health impacts here of with more frequent heat waves, as also coupled with the urban heat island effect. What does it do to our health? Well, it can trigger heat stroke and death, but then also increased temperatures, extreme heat can cause heart attacks and cardiovascular illnesses, aggravated respiratory illnesses, dehydration that impacts our health. And this leads to significant risk for death, and just seeing astounding numbers over the last 20 years of death from extreme heat waves. 70,000 in Europe 20 years ago. And as you know better than I, just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, in the Pacific Northwest itself, estimated 1,400 deaths due to the heat dome that sat over British Columbia, Washington State, and Oregon. Now, this event, this heat dome of 2021, has become one of those hallmarks amongst climate scientists like myself as a picture of the new normal. And colleagues of mine who specialize in what's called climate attribution sciences, of where they look to find the fingerprint of how climate change has impacted a specific extreme weather event, what they found was that this heat dome that sat over the Pacific Northwest, delivering temperatures in some parts of British Columbia nearing 128 degrees Fahrenheit, record-breaking temperatures that were hotter than it was in Death Valley, California at the time. What they found was that this heat dome event was a once in a millennia weather event. This means it would be expected to happen only once in 1,000 years. But due to climate change, something like this has become, at this scale and degree, has become 150 times more likely to happen. This is just astounding. And then we look at how that impacts people, our health. In Washington State, this was found to be, again, the deadliest weather-related event. And estimated that 14 to 1,500 people across the region lost their lives. Just heartbreaking and astounding. Now, when we look to impacts to our health from climate and also pollution, we find that everyone is impacted, but the truth is that not everyone is impacted equally. There are people and populations within our communities that are more vulnerable or more exposed, and therefore more impacted by the impacts of climate. This includes our children. It includes our elders and older adults. This includes low-income communities, as well as communities of color and Indigenous people as well. Let's dig into this a bit. When we look at the impact of climate on our children's health, what we find is even before they draw their own first breath, they are more vulnerable and at risk of climate impacts. I'm going to focus on heat but also touch on some of the other impacts. But in utero, in prenatal, our unborn children, they are at risk for low birth weight and preterm delivery due to extreme heat. This impacts our pregnant mothers and our children before they are born, being impacted by extreme heat. And I have to tell you all, in 2021, that summer, in June of 2021, when the heat dome sat over your region, I was pregnant with my second child. I was due later in that summer. And it was we also experienced on the East Coast of the US extreme heat. And my family and I, one June evening, went out to a baseball game while I was heavily pregnant. Had a great night, but it was hot. And I brought water with me, tried to stay hydrated. But within a few hours, I went into labor. And so asking even the nurses there of what they've observed, they have found just anecdotally from their own observations, the medical research backs this up as well, is that during heat waves can trigger preterm birth, can trigger labor. And this can have a significant impact on our children's health, our mother's health, and for their entire lifetimes. It's a significant threat. Within infancy, higher risk of heat-related illnesses because our children with their developing bodies are less able to control their body temperature. That summer, my young son and I, we spent most of the time indoors trying to stay cool from the heat and didn't venture outside because of those high temperatures. For our older children and adolescents, more at risk for negative impacts from extreme heat because they're outside more, playing outdoors, doing outdoor sports where they're more likely to be exposed to extreme heat and at risk for heat stroke and heat illness as well. When we look at other folks in our communities who are at risk, again, for extreme heat, it's adults over 65, people with pre-existing medical conditions, our low-income neighbors, and people who don't have access to air conditioning. When we look at the statistics of who was most impacted during the 2021 heat dome and who lost their life, it was our elders and folks who lived alone and didn't have access to air conditioning. This is just heartbreaking news, and especially for us as people of faith, cry out, this just isn't right. Some other work that I've done in extreme heat was looking at across our neighborhoods. Is there a difference in how we experience within even a single city, depending on where you live in that city? Are you experiencing a heat wave differently? This was work that I participated in while I was at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And what we did in our hometown of Washington, D.C., we wanted to figure out, did different neighborhoods experience the same heat wave differently? And what we found was very much yes. We found that depending on where you lived, you may have been experiencing much cooler temperatures, 85 degrees Fahrenheit, versus in the hottest part of our cities, topping over 100 degrees. This 15-degree Fahrenheit temperature difference, this is significant. We wanted to get a sense of who in our communities were experiencing these harsh conditions. And when we looked at income level, we found that it was often the poorest neighborhoods, those, again, who may not have resources to have an air conditioner or keep it running or have transport to get to a cooling station, who were most impacted. The hotter temperatures were in our poorer neighborhoods. When we looked at racial demographics, we found a racial component there where communities of color were also most often within those hotter temperatures. This is profoundly unfair. We also looked across the US and found that this was a story that played out not only in Washington, D.C., but cities large and small across the US. This urban heat island effect, neighborhood by neighborhood, was impacting disproportionately those poorest among us and our communities of color. And when we look to pollution, and my colleague, Reverend Mitch Hescox, is going to go into this in more detail tonight, but we also find that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, and soil. And again, as we look at this challenge and we look at these truths that are borne out both in lived experience as well as in our research, this is simply unfair and not right. With these challenges, however, there are opportunities also. And that's where I want us to really dive into for our last bit of our time together. And so from looking at the challenges that we face, it's very clear why the Defense Department calls climate change a threat multiplier. It makes bad situations worse. But when we look to the flip side and engage in the solutions, what we find is that they are benefit multipliers. We have the opportunity to solve many problems through climate solutions. This is really, really exciting. And that is why the Lancet Medical Journal calls tackling climate change the greatest opportunity at hand for global health. This is fantastic. Also, look at Forbes. Climate change as the greatest opportunity of all time for innovation as we use our God-given human ingenuity to solve these massive problems of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, bringing new innovations, new ideas, new ways of doing things to bear. This is an exciting time to live. And this is what we also call the win-win-wins of climate solutions at the Evangelical Environmental Network. At the very heart of it, we have the opportunity to defend life, to protect the health and well-being of all God's children. At the same time, when we engage in climate solutions, we are also protecting God's creation and living up to our call to be good stewards of God's creation. And then also, as we look at holistic well-being, including economic well-being, as we embark on creating this new clean economy, it has the benefit of creating new opportunities for family-sustaining careers in these new fields that address climate change, clean our air, clean our water, and protect God's creation. These are the win-win-wins of climate solutions. And so what we see if we go back to this matrix of things that climate impacts, when we engage in the solutions, we have the opportunity to make a positive impact on all of these things and many, many more. So one thing I often get at this point of sharing this background and this context is, well, what can I do? How can I engage in these solutions? And this is where I want to spend our last bit of time together. And with this question, a simple answer is first, well, let's start with what matters to you. In answering that question of what can I do, let's answer that with another question of starting with what matters to you. And let's then make the connection. Make that connection between how climate impacts what you care about. And then what's a solution that serves that? And this is where we can find that as we make this connection between the people and the places and the problems that God has called you to serve, as we make that connection with climate, we have the opportunity then to enhance our ministries and our service to our communities by bringing a climate solution to bear. So when we look at different ways to act, there are many different scales of engagement and action, from what we can do as individuals and in our own households, what we can do as a group, what we can do in our local communities, and then all the way looking at state and province level, national level, international level policy and solutions here. And for today, I want to focus here at the group level. what we can do as a group, as churches, as university campuses, as within our health institutions as well. What can we do together as a group to have a positive benefit for climate and health? And when I think about these institutions, our churches, our college campuses, our health institutions, I see some common threads of a deep commitment to serving the local community, a commitment to an opportunity to steward church, but building facility resources well, and also a heart to reach the next generation. Let's start with serving a local community. And again, using that threat of extreme heat. Well, one of these solutions that falls in the adaptation space is, again, hosting cooling centers. What does it look like for our churches, our college campuses, and other community institutions to put up a cooling center in those neighborhoods in close proximity to those who are most impacted? Also, developing a ministry to check on vulnerable neighbors during heat waves and extreme heat events. And as we look at some of our housing, what we often find for those most at risk, whether it's our elders, low-income neighbors, often they are grouped together. And so it's having vulnerable people check on each other can present a problem. And so what does it look like for us to go to them and check on our neighbors and care for one another? Another important solution that I love that's both adaptation and mitigation in terms of a climate solution is planting the right tree in the right place. A simple activity is that. Now, I showed you this map of neighborhood by neighborhood heat disparities in Washington, D.C., but I didn't tell you why. I didn't tell you why the map looks like this. And this comes to a matter of tree cover, of where there are mature, shady trees planted across the city, and where there's a lot of pavement and lack of tree cover. And during a heat wave, I know for myself, I would rather be under the shaded tree than where this gentleman is sitting amidst the pavement and experiencing the full brunt of that urban heat island effect. And so we see planting the right tree in the right place, and especially within our most at-risk neighborhoods, can lower street level temperatures by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It also has the added benefit of trees drawing down and sequestering carbon, a mitigation solution. And then this brings those co-benefits of health, reducing risk of heat illness. Trees also cut air pollution and can help prevent respiratory illness. Significant cost savings on cooling bills, especially for our low-income neighbors, and also restorative justice, reversing that legacy of redlining and disinvestment in our communities of color. Also has incredible benefits of bringing God's creation to our communities that may not have that God's creation within them. And as I've seen on the program, the park prescription break, this is what we all need, a park prescription. And by bringing God's creation into our neighborhoods, this has incredible benefits to our overall physical, mental, and spiritual health and well-being, reducing stress, creating new opportunities for us to be together. And if we zoom out and look at a macro level of how we can protect God's creation at a whole and harness the power of God's creation as a mitigation and adaptation solution for climate change, a natural climate solution, what we find is by simply reforesting, protecting, and restoring our forests, grasslands, agricultural lands, and wetlands, that can get us 1/3 of the way towards our carbon reduction goals that we need to have simply by protecting and harnessing the power of God's creation. This is good news. For sake of time, I'm not going to go into details on this other solution, but just to give you a quick flag of how we can also serve our low-income neighbors and help them become resilient and protected against extreme heat is helping them access home energy efficiency and weatherization assistance. This is another incredible adaptation and mitigation solution. But with that, stewarding our own resources as well in our churches and communities by making our facilities more energy efficient, putting rooftop solar or solar over a parking lot as well. This provides us with significant cost savings benefits as well. 30% of energy is found to be wasted from our church facilities in a study that was commissioned by the Evangelical Environmental Network. What would it look like to recoup those savings on our energy bill to put towards core mission areas? Incredible cost savings. We see this in our building facilities, but also in our own homes too. And then finally, reaching the next generation. I know there's presentations coming up today on the impact of eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, and especially on our youth. And we are just seeing this epidemic of eco-anxiety gripping our youth, where they feel great concern that they don't have that hope in a future that Scripture talks about. Taking action is one of the best antidotes for addressing this. And especially for folks like ourselves to simply be talking about it. Katharine Hayhoe says one of the most important things you can do to fight climate change is to talk about it. And what we find is you don't need to be a climate scientist like myself to have an impact. Family and friends, and I'll also say health professionals, extremely well respected and trusted sources of information about climate change. And that brings me just to conclude with the power of lifting your voice and engaging in advocacy. I know on the program, there's another talk about civic engagement and the role that policy plays as a climate solution. And at the Evangelical Environmental Network, we've had over 5 million Christians advocate with us for clean air, clean water, and a safer climate. And this makes a big difference in bringing our voice and sharing our unique perspective of why we care about climate and health. Different ways that you can lift your voice by, if you like to write, submitting to your local newspaper, sharing on social media, meeting with your elected officials, talking to your church and campus, just like we're doing today, and also talking about your friends and family, sharing with them something interesting that you learned at this weekend's conference. And so, if I can conclude, and I think this is also just so important for us as we can feel the burden of the great challenges that we face when it comes to climate and health, is staying rooted in Scripture and keeping our eyes on Jesus's mission on this earth. And as it says in John 10:10, Jesus came so that we may have life and have it abundantly. And so this is something that my colleague, Reverend Mitch Hescox, will go into in more detail later tonight. But we have this promise of abundant life. How, in the midst of these challenges, can we press into that more? Especially, and I'll leave you with this question to consider. When we join with God, who is in the restoration business, and we act together, what can we create? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica, for enlightening us. And we now have time for some questions from the audience. So I welcome your questions.
Fantastic question. And again, this gets to the complexity of the problem and why we need everyone bringing their ideas, their experiences, and their local knowledge to bear on these solutions. So what you are seeing here is less vulnerability in our southern states, even though they're experiencing hotter temperatures, because of infrastructure, because cities and communities are designed and homes more likely to, again, to have that air conditioning, less of our vulnerable neighbors being in those situations of experiencing these heat waves without some of those mitigating risk factors like access to air conditioning, having homes and buildings designed to beat the heat. And so as we are seeing hotter temperatures encroach into new areas that have never seen temperatures like that before, their infrastructure is not designed to cope with it. And that is where you see at the population level higher risk and seeing larger numbers of people more impacted at lower temperatures because of that infrastructure not being designed yet for those temperatures. You make a great point that it can mask vulnerability of maybe a smaller proportion, but again, the most of with a higher vulnerability in the southern states. We still have our unhoused neighbors, our lowest income neighbors who don't have access or can't afford to run their air conditioner. And so what you're seeing across the country, whether that's in Phoenix, Arizona, or up into British Columbia, programs to ensure that to provide more air conditioning units to low income neighbors. But then you've hit it. What about this problem as we adapt to these higher temperatures by increasing air conditioning use? What is this doing in the carbon emissions space? And that's where clean energy solutions are so critical. It's so critical that as we see rising temperatures, we see an increasing need for air conditioning to protect health in the from the acute effects of rising temperatures. We need to power we need to power it with clean energy that is not emitting more greenhouse gases and harmful pollution as well. That's a wonderful question. And I think it really hits at, I think, two different things, but at the overarching importance of advocacy, of engaging with our policymakers and bringing these innovative solutions to bear. And that's why I think it's so important so often in our civic engagement. Policymakers may be hearing from the few people who have the means and the motivation and often special interests to lift their voice, to be advocating for certain solutions. We need to have more constituents, and especially from vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations, meeting with our policymakers, informing them, educating them about these innovative solutions that are being led by the communities themselves. And so that's what at the Evangelical Environmental Network, we're really focused on doing, is bringing constituent voices that our policymakers don't often hear from, to be able to share that, because there is one sense of just a lack of awareness and lack of knowledge. But then also, and I'll say that I have seen this in action. We need more of it, but I have seen this in action just recently in the US with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Because local communities, especially faith communities, communities of color, and Indigenous communities, lifted up the importance of urban and community tree planting to address that urban heat island effect and the disparities of where there is trees. And there is a multi-billion-dollar investment now going from US federal funds, from those pieces of national legislation that is bringing those much needed funds and investments to now plant trees within those disinvested neighborhoods and communities. And it's required that those funds go to those communities that are in the most need. So overall, I think it's just the more that we can bring those solutions, those innovative solutions that might go under the radar, the more we can engage in the civic space and bring those to our decision makers, that's what we really need to do. Yeah, I thank you for this question. And you've really identified a key challenge for us. But I think, again, a key opportunity. What I've witnessed, and I'll even I'm sure from my colleague, Reverend Mitch Hescox, what he's witnessed over the decades is, in good news, an increase in awareness of creation care in our churches. It is not enough. There's so much work to do, but this is an exciting time of being able to new opportunities to integrate creation care into our church ministries. And again, I think one of the what I have witnessed in our work at EN, one of the most effective ways of doing that is one, a group of whether that's congregants or church leaders who, again, are passionate and do see the importance of creation care, but then helping make that, again, making that connection of showing how creation care can enhance our ministries across the board in our core mission areas, whether that's discipleship and our spiritual formation, but then also in our service and mission ministries, making that connection between how creation care, climate pollution impacts the poorest in our communities, and impacts can be an incredible new way of enhancing our ministry to address poverty, to address hunger, as a matter of life, making that connection of how it impacts the health and life of our children and at every stage of life. And so as we can help make that connection better and not frame it as here's an extra ministry that we have to tack on to our existing church activities, but this is how we can integrate it into what we are as a church already doing. And this is how taking this creation care solution or climate solution into account, we're better able, again, to serve the people, the places, the problems that we've been called to serve.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. So I'm, again, very grateful for you spending time out of your busy weekend. And I hope you have a chance to do a part prescription yourself. And we're just so grateful for your talk here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Such a pleasure and joy to join you this morning.